The morning mist clung to Fort McCall like a guilty secret, thick enough to muffle the sound of boots on concrete, but not thick enough to hide the whispers. Captain Ava Rilland stepped out of the officers' quarters at 0530, her breath forming. Small clouds in the December air as she surveyed the flight line stretching before her. At 31, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every stripe on her sleeve the hard way. Her service record read like a highlight reel of classified operations. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Somalia, and a stint with the elite 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment that nobody talked about. The Night Stalkers didn't advertise their pilots, and Ava preferred it that way. But Fort McCall wasn't Afghanistan, and the enemy here wore the same uniform she did. Well, look what the brass dragged in, came a voice from behind her. Master Sergeant Tony Riggs emerged from the maintenance hangar, clipboard in hand, and a smirk that never seemed to leave his weathered face. At 45, Riggs had been working helicopters since before Ava learned to drive, and he made sure everyone knew it. "Morning, Sergeant," Ava replied evenly, not breaking stride as she headed toward Hangar 18. "Heard you're taking over Charlie Company's flight operations?" Riggs continued, falling into step beside her. "Funny thing, we've had 3 different COS in the past 18 months. None of them seemed to stick around very long." There it was. The first warning shot, delivered with that particular brand of military politeness that could cut glass. Ava had heard the rumors during her briefing yesterday. Fort McCall had a problem with female officers in leadership positions. They had a way of finding themselves transferred, demoted, or worse, grounded on mysterious medical leave. "I'm not planning on going anywhere, Sergeant," Ava said, stopping in front of the massive hangar doors. "I'm here to fly helicopters and train pilots. That's exactly what I intend to do." Riggs chuckled, but there was no humor in it. That's what Captain Williams said too, right before she had that ... unfortunate incident with the hydraulic failure. And Captain Foster before her. Terrible shame about that flight control malfunction. The words hung in the cold air like ice crystals. 2 female pilots, 2 mysterious mechanical failures. The pattern was as clear as the morning sky, but proving it would be another matter entirely. "I appreciate the history lesson," Ava said, her voice steady as steel. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have aircraft to inspect." Inside Hangar 18, the UH-60 Black Hawk, designated as Hawk 109, sat under harsh fluorescent lights, its black paint dulled by years of hard service. But as Ava approached, her trained eye immediately picked up details that made her pulse quicken. The hydraulic reservoirs were spotless. Too spotless. In her experience, when mechanics polished something that usually stayed dirty, they were either hiding something or following orders to make it look perfect for inspection. Crew Chief Master Sergeant Jake Monroe emerged from beneath the aircraft, his jumpsuit stained with oil and his expression carefully neutral. Unlike Riggs, Monroe was professional. He handed over the logbook without commentary and stepped back to let her work. "General Henley wants this bird ready for a demonstration flight today," Monroe said quietly. "Congressional visitors coming through tomorrow, and Command wants footage of our training operations." Ava flipped through the maintenance logs, her eyes scanning for red flags. The last major inspection was 92 days ago. Not unusual, but the tail rotor servo replacement was flagged yellow, meaning it needed monitoring. What caught her attention was the signature authorizing the overnight clearance. Colonel Derek Marshall, the base deputy commander. The signature was pressed so deep into the paper that it embossed the page underneath. In Ava's experience, when someone signed their name that hard, they were either very angry or very nervous. "Sergeant Monroe," she said, not looking up from him. "The logbook. This overnight rush job. Whose idea was that?" Monroe's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Orders from the colonel, ma'am," said the general. "Wanted the bird camera ready by 0800. And the maintenance crew that did the work? Night shift. Already gone home." Another red flag. Night shift maintenance was where corners got cut and mistakes got buried. Ava closed the logbook and looked Monroe directly in the eye. "You've been working helicopters for how long, Sergeant?" 15 years, ma'am." "Then you know the difference between routine maintenance and a rush job that cuts corners." She tapped the logbook. Which one was this? Monroe hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Ava to see the conflict in his eyes. "Ma'am, I follow orders. But if I were you, I'd run that pre-flight checklist twice." There wasn't a direct answer, but it was enough. Someone with 15 years of experience was telling her to be extra careful. And in military speak, that was practically screaming that something was wrong. As Ava climbed into the cockpit to begin her pre-flight inspection, she noticed Riggs watching from the hangar office window, his phone pressed to his ear. Even from 50 feet away, she could see the satisfied smile on his face. The cockpit smelled wrong, too clean, with the artificial scent of citrus solvent trying to mask something else. New hydraulic fluid, maybe, or fresh lubricant on parts that shouldn't need it. As she powered up the console, the screens flickered through their startup sequence, all showing green. But the calibration tests lagged by almost 2 seconds before settling, a software delay that suggested someone had been messing with the fault detection systems. Lieutenant Marcus Torres, her assigned co-pilot, slid into the left seat with barely concealed nervousness. At 26, he was young enough to still believe the system worked the way it was supposed to, but old enough to have heard the stories about what happened to pilots who asked too many questions. "Everything looking good, Captain?" he asked, his voice tight with uncertainty. "We'll find out," Ava replied, beginning the engine startup sequence. "Torres, if we get any anomalous readings during flight, and I mean anything that doesn't feel right, you speak up immediately. Clear?" "Yes, ma'am." As the rotors spun up and the Black Hawk lifted off the tarmac, Ava felt the familiar thrill of flight mixed with something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine fear. Not fear of enemy fire or mechanical failure, but fear of betrayal from within her own ranks. The helicopter climbed smoothly into the morning sky, but Ava's instincts, honed by years of flying in hostile territory, screamed that she was heading into an ambush. And this time, the enemy wasn't waiting in the mountains of Afghanistan. They were watching from the ground below, waiting to see if their plan would work. The flight started smooth, too smooth. Ava had logged over 3,000 hours in Black Hawks, and she knew the subtle vibrations and engine notes that meant everything was working properly. Hawk 109 was flying like a bird fresh off the assembly line, which for a helicopter with 15 years of hard service should have been impossible. Tower, Hawk 109 requesting pattern altitude for training exercise. She radioed, keeping her voice professional despite the growing unease in her gut. Hawk 109, you're cleared to 2,500 feet. Maintain current heading. As they climbed, Lieutenant Torres fidgeted with his harness straps. "Captain, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "The other female pilots who were stationed here, what really happened to them?" It was a dangerous question, the kind that could end a young officer's career if the wrong person overheard it. But Torres was asking because he'd heard the same whispers everyone had, that Captain Williams' hydraulic failure hadn't been random, and Captain Foster's control malfunction had happened right after she'd filed a complaint about maintenance irregularities. "What do you think happened, Lieutenant?" Torres was quiet for a moment, watching the altimeter climb. "I think someone wanted them gone. I think they're going to try the same thing with you." Before Ava could respond, the first anomaly hit. A brief hydraulic pressure drop that lasted exactly 2 seconds before returning to normal. No alarms, no warning lights, just a subtle change in the way the cyclic felt in her hands. Torres didn't notice. His attention was on the instrument panel, which showed all greens, but Ava felt it. After years of flying aircraft held together with determination and spare parts, she could sense problems before the instruments caught them. And this wasn't a gradual failure or normal wear. This was systematic. Control, this is Hawk 109. We're showing some minor hydraulic fluctuations. Requesting permission to return to base. There was a pause that lasted too long. Hawk 109. Our telemetry shows all systems normal. Continue with training exercise as planned. The response came too quickly, too smoothly. Someone had been expecting her to report problems, and they had an answer ready. Ava exchanged glances with Torres, who was now paying attention to more than just the instruments. "Captain," he said quietly, "they're monitoring our flight data in real time?" "They are now." 10 minutes later, the hydraulic system hiccuped again. This time, Torres felt it too, a slight but unmistakable shudder in the controls that lasted just long enough to be concerning but not long enough to trigger automatic warnings. "That's not normal," Torres said, his voice tight. "No, it's not." Ava began a slow descent, testing the aircraft's responses. Everything felt sluggish, like the helicopter was fighting her inputs instead of responding to them. "Someone's been playing with our bird, Lieutenant." "You mean sabotage?" The word hung between them like a live grenade. In the military, accusations of sabotage weren't made lightly. They required evidence, proof, and a willingness to take on the entire chain of command. But as another hydraulic flutter made the cyclic stick in her hands, Ava knew they were past the point of giving anyone the benefit of the doubt. Tower, Hawk 109 declaring a precautionary emergency. "We're experiencing intermittent flight control issues and need immediate return to base." This time, the pause was even longer. "Hawk 109, stand by." The radio crackled with background conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. Someone was arguing, voices raised but too distorted to make out words. Finally, a different voice came back, deeper, more authoritative. "Hawk 109, this is Colonel Marshall. Our maintenance chief reports no issues with your aircraft. You are ordered to complete the training exercise as briefed." There it was. The man whose signature had authorized the overnight maintenance was now personally ordering her to keep flying a helicopter that was trying to kill her. Torres looked at her with wide eyes, understanding perfectly what was happening. "Sir, with respect, I'm the pilot in command and I'm declaring this aircraft unsafe for continued flight. Captain Rilland." The colonel's voice was ice cold now. "You will complete your assigned mission." "That's a direct order." Ava had been in the military long enough to know that disobeying a direct order was career suicide. But she'd also been flying long enough to know that dead pilots don't have careers to worry about. "Negative, sir. I'm bringing this bird home, now." She banked hard toward Fort McCall, ignoring the string of increasingly hostile radio calls. From the tower, Torres was gripping his harness so tightly his knuckles were white, but he hadn't said a word of protest. Whatever else he was, the young lieutenant wasn't a coward. The hydraulic system failed completely at 1,500 feet. The cyclic went dead in her hands, and the collective required all her strength to move. Warning lights flooded the instrument panel. Like Christmas decorations, and the helicopter immediately began losing altitude in a barely controlled descent. "Emergency power on," Ava called out, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Torres, get ready to transmit our position." Controls responding sluggishly, she continued, fighting to keep the helicopter level. "We're going to make it, but it's going to be ugly." The ground rushed up to meet them as Ava aimed for the clearest patch of open field she could find. The Black Hawk hit hard, bounced twice, and slid 30 feet before coming to rest in a cloud of dust and scattered snow. For a moment, there was only silence except for the ticking of cooling metal and the whistle of wind through the damaged rotor system. "You okay, Lieutenant?" "Yes, ma'am." Tora's voice was shaky but strong. "Captain ... they tried to kill us." Ava was already unbuckling her harness. "No, Lieutenant. They tried to kill me. You were just unlucky enough to be along for the ride." As she climbed out of the cockpit, she could hear helicopters approaching, the rescue birds that had been standing by, waiting for exactly this outcome. But what they found when they arrived wasn't what anyone had expected. Instead of a traumatized pilot grateful to be alive, they found Captain Ava Rilland calmly photographing the severed hydraulic lines and bagging pieces of obviously sabotaged equipment. The evidence was clear, documented, and undeniable. And for the first time since arriving at Fort McCall, Ava Rilland was smiling. The debriefing room felt like a courtroom designed by someone who'd never seen justice served. Colonel Derek Marshall sat at the head of a polished conference table, flanked by two majors Ava didn't recognize and a civilian in an expensive suit who hadn't bothered to introduce himself. The walls were lined with official portraits of commanders past and present, their painted eyes seeming to watch as the living prepared to bury the truth. Ava sat across from them, still in her flight suit with the bagged hydraulic components, a memory card from her camera placed neatly in front of her. Lieutenant Torres sat to her right, his face pale but determined. The court reporter in the corner hadn't looked up from her stenotype machine in 20 minutes. "Captain Rilland," Colonel Marshall began, his voice carrying the false warmth of a funeral director. "We're all grateful that you and Lieutenant Torres survived yesterday's incident. However, we need to address some serious concerns about your conduct during the emergency." The setup was elegant in its simplicity. By focusing on her conduct rather than the obvious sabotage, they were flipping the narrative. She wasn't a victim of attempted murder. She was a problem pilot who disobeyed orders and endangered her co-pilot. "I'd be happy to address any concerns, sir," Ava replied evenly. "Perhaps we could start with how hydraulic lines don't sever themselves in mid-flight." Marshall's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. According to Master Sergeant Riggs' preliminary investigation, the failure appears to be consistent with normal wear and fatigue in an aging aircraft. "These things happen, Captain. Do they?" Ava reached for the evidence bag containing the severed hydraulic line. "Because this particular line was installed 6 months ago, according to the maintenance logs. And these cut marks." She held up the bag so everyone could see the clean, deliberate slice through the rubber. "I've seen a lot of battle damage, Colonel. This isn't wear and fatigue. This is sabotage." The civilian leaned forward slightly. "Captain, you're making a very serious accusation. Do you have any proof that this damage was intentional?" "I have the physical evidence right here." I have photographs of the installation showing clear tool marks where someone accessed the hydraulic bay. And I have the maintenance logs showing that this aircraft received unauthorized overnight work that bypassed normal safety protocols." "Unauthorized?" Marshall's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise. "I personally signed the work order." "At whose request?" The question landed like a slap. For just a moment, Marshall's composure cracked, and Ava saw something ugly flash across his face, the look of a man who'd been caught but wasn't ready to admit it. "I don't appreciate your tone, Captain. And I don't appreciate being handed a sabotaged aircraft and ordered to fly it despite reporting safety concerns." Ava's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath now. "Someone wanted that helicopter to go down, and they wanted me in it when it happened." One of the majors, A thin man with nervous eyes cleared his throat. "Captain, are you suggesting that someone in the U.S. military deliberately tried to harm you?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Major. I'm stating it as fact." The room went dead quiet except for the rapid clicking of the court reporter's machine. Torres shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but when Ava glanced at him, he gave her an almost imperceptible nod of support. Marshall stood up slowly, his hands flat on the table. "Captain Rilland, you're clearly suffering from the after-effects of a traumatic incident. I'm ordering you to report to the base medical officer for a full psychological evaluation. You're grounded pending the results." There it was, the kill shot. Question her mental state, ground her indefinitely, and let the investigation disappear into the bureaucratic maze while she fought to prove her sanity. It was the same playbook they'd used on Williams and Foster. But Ava had been expecting this move. "Carl, before I submit to any medical evaluation, I'd like to invoke my rights under Article 138 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I'm formally requesting a complaint against you for knowingly ordering me to fly an unsafe aircraft." The Article 138 complaint was the nuclear option, a formal accusation that would trigger an investigation by the Inspector General and couldn't be buried by local command. Marshall's face went white. "Captain, you're making a serious mistake." "Your career? My career?" Ava stood up, matching his posture across the table. "Kyle, someone tried to murder me yesterday. They sabotaged my aircraft and then ordered me to keep flying it when I reported problems. My career is the least of my concerns right now." The civilian finally spoke up. "Captain Rilland, perhaps we can resolve this without formal complaints. The base has had some challenges with maintenance oversight recently. If you're willing to accept a transfer to another facility, you want to transfer me?" Ava's laugh was sharp and humorless. "The same way you transferred Captain Williams and Captain Foster? How convenient." "Those were routine reassignments. Those were cover-ups." Ava picked up her evidence bag and camera. "And this conversation is over. You'll be hearing from the Inspector General's office within 24 hours. As she turned to leave, Marshall's voice stopped her. "Captain Rilland, you're making enemies of people who could have been allies. This base has procedures, chains of command. You can't just walk in here and accuse decorated officers of attempted murder without consequences." Ava turned back to face him, and for the first time since entering the room, she let her mask drop. The look she gave Marshall was the same one she'd given Taliban fighters moments before pulling the trigger. "Carl, I've been shot at by experts. I've flown through missile attacks and survived 3 helicopter crashes in combat zones. If you think I'm afraid of your consequences, you've seriously misunderstood who you're dealing with." She walked out of the room with Torres beside her, leaving behind a table full of men who were just beginning to understand that their carefully planned cover-up had run into someone who couldn't be intimidated. In the hallway outside, Torres finally found his voice. "Captain, what happens now?" "Now?" Ava smiled grimly. "Now we find out how deep this goes, and then we burn it all down." Behind them, she could hear angry voices through the closed door. The sound of conspirators realizing their victim was about to become their hunter. The war was just beginning. The Inspector General's office at Fort Braxton was a 3-hour drive from Fort McCall, but Ava made it in 2.5. "Lieutenant." Torres had volunteered to come along, despite her warnings that associating with her could end his career before it really started. "Ma'am, with respect, my career won't mean much if I'm dead," he'd said when she tried to talk him out of it. "Besides, they put me in that helicopter too. This isn't just about you anymore." Colonel Rebecca Hayes ran the IG office with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years cutting through military bureaucracy to find the truth. At 52, she was a legend in investigative circles, the woman who'd exposed the training accident cover-up at Fort betting, and the procurement scandal that had nearly bankrupted the Army's helicopter program. She listened to Ava's story without interruption, occasionally making notes, but never taking her eyes off Ava's face. When Ava finished, Hayes leaned back in her chair and studied the photographs and evidence bags spread across her desk. "Captain Brilland, I'm going to be direct with you. What you're describing isn't just criminal negligence or even garden-variety corruption. You're talking about a conspiracy to commit murder involving field-grade officers. Do you understand what that means?" "Yes, ma'am." "It means someone wanted me dead badly enough to risk their careers and their freedom. It also means that if you're wrong, even slightly wrong, your career is over, and you'll likely face court-martial for making false accusations against superior officers." Hayes picked up one of the photographs showing the severed hydraulic line. "But if you're right, if I'm right, they'll try again. And next time, they might succeed." Hayes nodded slowly. "I've already made some preliminary calls to Fort McCall. Colonel Marshall has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Master Sergeant Riggs has been reassigned to administrative duties, and General Henley has requested a full audit of all maintenance operations for the past 2 years." Ava felt a surge of satisfaction, but Hayes wasn't finished. "However, I need you to understand something, Captain. The people you're accusing have friends in high places. General Henley is being considered for promotion to the Pentagon. Colonel Marshall's father is a retired 4-star general with significant political connections. This investigation is going to attract attention from people who have the power to make it disappear. Are you saying I should back down?" "I'm saying you need to be prepared for a fight that goes way beyond Fort McCall." Hayes opened a thick folder and pulled out a document marked with classification stamps. "There's something else you need to know. You're not the first female pilot to experience mechanical failures at bases under General Henley's command." The document was a summary report from the Army Safety Center, detailing helicopter incidents involving female pilots over the past 5 years. The pattern was unmistakable. 12 incidents, 8 different bases, all under commands that had been restructured to reduce female participation in combat aviation roles. Captain Foster and Captain Williams were just the most recent, Hayes continued. There have been others. Most took medical retirements or transfers rather than fight. A few filed complaints that mysteriously got lost in the system. You're the first one to survive with clear evidence of sabotage. Ava studied the report, her anger building with each case summary. This is systematic, organized. It appears to be. The question is how high it goes and how far they're willing to escalate to protect themselves. Hayes closed the folder. Captain, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Are you prepared to see this through to the end, no matter what it costs you personally? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Ava thought about Captain Williams, medically retired after her accident and never flying again. She thought about Captain Foster, transferred to a desk job in logistics and slowly drinking herself into an early grave. She thought about the 8 other women whose careers had been destroyed to protect the system that saw them as threats to be eliminated. Colonel Hayes, I didn't survive 3 combat tours and a sabotaged helicopter to let them win now. Whatever it takes. Hayes smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. Good, because I've been waiting for someone with the evidence and the backbone to take these bastards down. She pulled out another folder, this one even thicker. We're going to need help, though. The kind of help that doesn't come through official channels. What kind of help? The kind that comes from people who've been keeping quiet too long. Hayes opened the folder to reveal a list of names, pilots, mechanics, administrative personnel, all with contact information and brief notes. Over the past 2 years, I've been quietly documenting reports of irregularities at various bases. People who noticed things but were afraid to speak up. People who lost friends to accidents that didn't feel accidental. Ava scanned the list, recognizing several names. You've been building a case. I've been building a network. What I needed was a catalyst, someone with the credibility and evidence to make it all stick. Hayes stood up. Captain Rilland, congratulations. You just became the lead plaintiff in the biggest military justice case in a decade. As they left the IG office that evening, Torres asked the question that had been hanging over them all day. Captain, what if they try to sabotage? U.S. again? Not just aircraft, careers, reputations, our families? Ava looked up at the clear winter sky, thinking about all the time she'd flown through hostile airspace with nothing but skill and determination keeping her alive. Lieutenant, they already played their best card. They tried to kill me, and I'm still here. Everything else is just noise. But even as she said it, she knew the real war was just beginning. And this time, the enemy wouldn't just be trying to ground her. They'd be trying to destroy everything she'd ever worked for. The secure conference room at Fort Braxton hummed with nervous energy as Colonel Hayes called the meeting to order. Around the table sat 8 people who, until 3 days ago, had been strangers united only by their suspicions and their fear. Now they were co-conspirators in what Hayes had started calling Operation Cleanhouse. Ava recognized some faces. From the personnel files Hayes had shown her, Chief Warrant Officer Rachel Barnes had been the maintenance supervisor at Fort Stewart when Captain Maria Vasquez's Black Hawk had suffered rotor bearing failure during a routine training flight. Vasquez had survived but suffered spinal injuries that ended her flying career. Barnes had always suspected the bearing had been deliberately weakened. Major Tom Anderson from Fort Campbell had watched 3 female pilots in his squadron get transferred out after a series of increasingly serious mechanical failures. He'd started keeping unofficial records when the official ones kept disappearing from the maintenance databases. Staff Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez had been working avionics at Fort Rucker when she'd noticed someone making unauthorized modifications to flight control software, modifications that would cause systems to fail gradually rather than trigger immediate warnings. She'd reported it up the chain and been reassigned to a different base within a week. Ladies and gentlemen, Hayes began, what we're looking at isn't just a pattern of accidents or even isolated cases of sabotage. Based on the evidence you've all provided, we're dealing with a coordinated campaign spanning multiple bases and involving personnel at every level of command. She activated the wall-mounted display, showing a network analysis that connected the various incidents across time and geography. Lines linked common personnel transfers, similar mechanical failures, and shared command structures. At the center of the web was a cluster of names that made Ava's blood run cold. General Marcus Henley wasn't just a commanding officer at Fort McCall. Over the past 6 years, he'd held command positions at 4 of the bases where female pilots had suffered mysterious accidents. Colonel Derek Marshall had been his deputy at 3 of those bases. Master Sergeant Tony Riggs had been transferred between facilities, always arriving a few months before the incidents began. They're not just covering up individual cases, Ava realized aloud. They're running a systematic campaign to drive women out of combat aviation. That's our working theory, Hayes confirmed. The question is proving it in a way that will stand up in court-martial proceedings and survive the political pressure that's about to come down on all of us. Chief Barnes leaned forward. Colonel, I've been thinking about Captain Vasquez's accident. The rotor bearing that failed, it was replaced 2 weeks before the incident with a part that had a manufacturing defect. Not visible damage, but metallurgical. Flaws that would cause catastrophic failure under stress. At the time, I thought it was just bad luck. You still have access to that bearing? Hayes asked. I kept it. Against regulations, but something felt wrong about throwing away evidence. Barnes pulled out a sealed evidence bag. I had it independently analyzed last year. The metallurgy report shows clear signs of deliberate weakening, chemical etching. That would be nearly impossible to detect without specialized equipment. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just sabotage. It was sabotage using sophisticated techniques that required resources, knowledge, and access that could only come from within the military's own supply and maintenance systems. Major Anderson spoke up. If they're willing to go that far, they're not going to just give up because we figured out their game. They're going to fight back, and they're going to fight dirty. As if summoned by his words, Hayes' secure phone rang. She answered it with a curt, "Hayes," then listened for several minutes, her face growing increasingly grim. "Understood. Thank you for the heads up." She hung up and looked around the table. That was a friend at the Pentagon. General Henley has just filed a formal complaint with the Army Chief of Staff, claiming that I'm conducting an unauthorized investigation based on the fabricated evidence of a mentally unstable pilot. The attack was swift and predictable. Question Ava's mental state, discredit the investigation, and use political pressure to shut everything down before it could gain momentum. There's more, Hayes continued. Colonel Marshall has hired a civilian attorney, one of those high-powered Washington firms that specializes in defending military officers accused of misconduct. Someone spending serious money to make this go away. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez looked around the table. Nervously, "Colonel, maybe we should consider that they have resources we don't. Political connections, money, people in high places who owe them favors. What do we have?" Ava had been quiet through most of the meeting, but now she stood up and walked to the evidence display. Photos of severed hydraulic lines, doctored maintenance logs, and falsified inspection reports covered the wall like a mosaic of corruption. "What do we have?" She turned to face the group. "We have the truth. We have physical evidence. And we have something they don't expect. Which is, we have each other." Ava gestured to the people around the table. "They've been counting on us staying isolated, staying quiet, being too afraid to speak up. They've been picking us off one by one, destroying careers and covering their tracks because no one was willing to connect the dots." She picked up Barnes' evidence bag containing the sabotage rotor bearing. "But now we have connected the dots. We have evidence from multiple bases, multiple incidents, all pointing to the same network of people. They can attack my credibility, but they can't attack all of us. They can make one case disappear, but they can't make 8 cases disappear." Hayes nodded slowly. "Captain Rilland is right. The key to this investigation isn't any single piece of evidence. It's the pattern, the systematic nature of what they've been doing." "So what's our next move?" Major Anderson asked. Hayes pulled out a thick folder marked with multiple classification stamps. "Tomorrow morning, I'm briefing the Secretary of the Army personally. The Inspector General has elevated this to the highest levels, and there are people in Washington who are very interested in making sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. And if the Secretary decides to bury it anyway." Ava smiled grimly. "Then we go public. There are reporters who specialize in military corruption cases, and this story has everything they love. Cover-ups, attacks on whistleblowers, and a conspiracy that goes right to the top." As the meeting broke up, Chief Barnes approached Ava privately. "Captain, I want you to know something. When Maria Vasquez was lying in that hospital bed with 3 crushed vertebrae, she made me promise that if I ever got the chance to nail the bastards who did this to her, I wouldn't let it go. Are you going to keep that promise?" Barnes looked at the evidence bag in her hands, then back at Ava. "Ma'am, I've been keeping it for 3 years. I'm not about to stop now." Outside the conference room, Lieutenant Torres was waiting with a grim expression. "Captain, we may have a problem. I just got word from a friend back at Fort McCall. Master Sergeant Riggs has been asking questions about my family, where they live, where my sister goes to college, that kind of thing. The message was clear. They weren't just targeting the whistleblowers anymore. They were going after their families. Ava felt the familiar calm that came over her in combat situations, the moment when fear transformed into focused determination. Lieutenant, how do you feel about taking some emergency leave to visit your family? I'd feel better if you came with me, ma'am. I have a feeling they're not done with either of us yet. As they walked toward the parking lot, Ava's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Some accidents are more permanent than others. Drop the investigation while you still can. She showed the message to Torres, then deleted it. Lieutenant, remember what I told you about flying through hostile territory? Yes, ma'am. That the enemy only gets scarier when you're getting close to the target. Exactly. And judging by these threats, we must be right on top of them. The hearing room at the Pentagon was everything Ava had imagined it would be. Polished wood paneling, formal portraits of military leaders, and an atmosphere thick with the weight of institutional power. But what she hadn't expected was the crowd of reporters clustered outside the building. Cameras and microphones thrust toward anyone in uniform who might have a comment about what the Washington Post was already calling the biggest military scandal since Abu Ghraib. Colonel Hayes had been right about one thing. Once the story broke into the public sphere, it took on a life of its own. Secretary of the Army Janet Collins was a formidable woman in her 60s who'd spent 30 years climbing the ranks before transitioning to civilian leadership. She sat at the head of a horseshoe-shaped table, flanked by the Army's top legal counsel and the Inspector General himself. Across from them sat General Hemley, Colonel Marshall, and a team of expensive civilian attorneys who looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom. Ava and Lieutenant Torres occupied a small table to one side, with Colonel Hayes serving as their representative. The power imbalance was obvious and intentional. 2 junior officers against the entire Army establishment. This hearing will determine whether the allegations raised by Captain Rilland warrant a full court-martial investigation or whether they represent, as General Hemley's counsel suggests, the fabricated claims of an unstable officer seeking attention. Secretary Collins began. General Hemley, you may present your defense. Hemley's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Robert Kendricks, stood with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case he cared about winning. Madam Secretary, what we have here is a tragic example of how combat stress can manifest. Years after deployment, Captain Rilland has an exemplary service record, which makes her current delusions all the more heartbreaking. He clicked the remote, and a PowerPoint presentation filled the wall screen. The evidence will show that Captain Rilland suffered significant psychological trauma during her deployments with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Classified operations in Afghanistan and Somalia exposed her to extreme stress that has now manifested as paranoid ideation and conspiracy theories. The slide showed Ava's medical records, psychological evaluations, and incident reports from her combat tours. Everything was technically accurate, but presented in a way that made her sound unstable and unreliable. Furthermore, Kendricks continued, the so-called evidence of sabotage can be easily explained by normal maintenance issues and the captain's own negligent pre-flight procedures. Master Sergeant Riggs, a decorated veteran with 30 years of exemplary service, has prepared a detailed technical analysis showing how wear and fatigue could have caused the hydraulic failure. The presentation was masterful, professional, detailed, and completely false. But Ava had to admit it was convincing. If she hadn't lived through the experience herself, she might have believed it. When Kendricks finished, Secretary Collins turned to Colonel Hayes. Colonel, Captain Rilland, you may present your case. Hayes stood and activated her own presentation. Unlike the slick corporate graphics of Henley's defense, her slides were stark, factual, and devastating. Madam Secretary, what we're dealing with isn't the delusions of a traumatized pilot. It's a systematic campaign spanning multiple bases and involving the deliberate sabotage of aircraft flown by female pilots. The first slide showed a timeline of incidents across 6 different installations over 5 years. The evidence shows that General Henley, Colonel Marshall, and Master Sergeant Riggs were present at 4 of the 6 bases where these incidents occurred. In each case, they arrived within months of being assigned, implemented new maintenance protocols that bypassed normal safety procedures, and oversaw incidents that ended the flying careers of female pilots. The presentation continued with technical analysis of the sabotage components, showing clear evidence of deliberate tampering. Chief Barnes' metallurgy report on the rotor bearing was particularly damning. The chemical etching patterns were too precise and systematic to be accidental. But Hayes saved the best for last. Furthermore, we have recovered communications between the conspirators that show clear intent to harm female pilots. She clicked to a slide showing email fragments recovered from Colonel Marshall's computer. Quote, "The Rillen problem needs to be handled permanently. She's too high profile to transfer quietly." End quote. The room erupted. Henley's attorneys were shouting objections about unauthorized access to classified communications. General Henley himself had gone pale, his hands gripping the table hard enough to show white knuckles. Secretary Collins slammed her gavel. "Order. Colonel Hayes, how did you obtain these communications?" "Through a lawful Inspector General investigation with proper warrants, Madam Secretary. The communications were recovered from a backup server that Colonel Marshall apparently forgot to wipe when he thought the investigation was being buried." Kendricks was on his feet again. "Madam Secretary, these alleged communications are clearly fabricated. My client categorically denies." "Your client can deny whatever he wants," Hayes interrupted. "But digital forensics don't lie. We have metadata, server logs, and backup copies that prove authenticity." The hearing continued for another 3 hours, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The email communications were the smoking gun that transformed the case from circumstantial evidence to clear proof of conspiracy. When Secretary Collins finally called for a recess, Ava stepped outside for air and found herself surrounded by reporters. "Captain Rilland, how does it feel to expose a conspiracy that goes to the highest levels of Army command?" "Captain, are you concerned about retaliation from other officers who might be involved? What message does this send to other female pilots in the military?" Ava had been media trained during her time with the Night Stalkers, but this was different. These weren't embedded reporters asking about mission objectives. These were investigative journalists who smelled blood in the water. "I'll make one statement," she said, facing the cameras directly. "For 5 years, female pilots in the U.S. Army have been targeted for elimination through systematic sabotage and cover-ups. Some of my sisters in arms died. Others were permanently disabled. All of them were betrayed by the system they'd sworn to serve." She paused, making sure every camera was focused on her. "Today, that stops. Not because the system decided to police itself, but because people with courage chose to speak. Truth to power. No one should have to risk their life just to serve their country with dignity." The questions continued, but Ava walked back into the building without answering them. She'd said what needed to be said. 2 hours later, Secretary Collins reconvened the hearing for her decision. "After reviewing all evidence presented, I am ordering immediate court-martial proceedings for General Marcus Henley, Colonel Derek Marshall, and Master Sergeant Anthony Riggs on charges of conspiracy, sabotage, attempted murder, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline." The words fell like hammer blows. General Hemley's career, 30 years of service, commendations, and political connections, evaporated in a single sentence. Furthermore, Collins continued, I am ordering a comprehensive review of maintenance and safety protocols at all Army aviation facilities, with particular attention to incidents involving female pilots over the past decade. As the military police approached to escort Henley and Marshall from the room, the general looked directly at Ava. His expression wasn't anger or hatred. It was pure calculation, the look of a man already planning his next move. This isn't over, Captain, he said quietly as the MPs cuffed him. You have no idea how deep this goes. The threat was clear, but so was Ava's response. She stood at attention and rendered a perfect salute, not to his rank, but to the uniform. He'd dishonored. Sir, it's over for you. That's all that matters to me. As they led him away, Lieutenant Torres leaned over to whisper, Captain, what did he mean about how deep this goes? Ava watched the doors close behind the man who'd tried to have her killed. I don't know, Lieutenant, but I have a feeling we're about to find out. The court-martial of General Marcus Hemley began on a cold January morning with protesters on both sides of the Pentagon gates. Supporters of military reform carried signs reading, Justice for Female Pilots, and End the Cover-Up, while a smaller group of traditionalists held banners declaring, Support our generals and political witch hunt. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The prosecution team, led by Colonel Janet Morrison, had spent 2 months building an airtight case. The defense, still headed by the expensive Robert Kendricks, was fighting for more than just their client's freedom. They were fighting to contain a scandal that threatened to expose decades of institutional corruption. Ava sat in the gallery with the other witnesses, watching as 12 military officers filed into the jury box. These weren't career politicians or civilian bureaucrats. They were colonels and generals who'd spent their lives in the system, now being put on trial. Their verdict would determine whether the military was willing to hold its highest ranks accountable. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. Colonel Morrison laid out the conspiracy timeline, the evidence of systematic sabotage, and the communications that proved intent to harm. But what made the case truly compelling was the human cost. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, Morrison said, gesturing toward a section of the gallery where 8 women in uniform sat watching. The defense will try to convince you that this case is about maintenance failures and bureaucratic misunderstandings. But look at these women. Look at Captain Maria Vasquez, permanently disabled when her rotor bearing was deliberately weakened. Look at Captain Jennifer Foster, whose career ended when her flight controls were sabotaged. Look at Captain Sarah Williams, who survived her crash but will never fly again. The camera lingered on each face as Morrison spoke. These weren't statistics or case numbers. They were real women whose lives had been shattered by men who saw them as threats to be eliminated. And look at Captain Ava Rilland, who survived the most recent attempt on her life only because her skill as a pilot exceeded their ability to kill her. When Morrison finished, the defense team looked grim. Kendricks had built his career on character, assassination, and legal technicalities. But this case had too much evidence and too many victims for his usual tactics to work. The first witness was Chief Warrant Officer Rachel Barnes, who testified about the metallurgical analysis of the sabotage rotor bearing. Her technical expertise was unshakable, and the photos of the chemically weakened metal were damning. Major Tom Anderson followed, describing the pattern of incidents at multiple bases and the systematic transfer of personnel who asked inconvenient questions. Staff Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez testified about the software modifications she'd discovered, changes designed to mask system failures until they became catastrophic. But the prosecution's star witness was Lieutenant Marcus Torres. The young, officer had matured considerably in the months since the incident. His testimony was clear, precise, and utterly believable as he described the moments when Hawk 109's hydraulic system failed and how Captain Rilland's skill had saved both their lives. "Lieutenant Torres," Morrison asked, "in your opinion, what would have happened if Captain Rilland had been a less experienced pilot?" "Ma'am, we would have died. There's no question about that. The helicopter was designed to fail catastrophically, not gradually. If Captain Rilland hadn't been able to authoritate us down safely, we would have crashed with no survivors." The defense's cross-examination was brutal but unsuccessful. Kendricks tried to suggest that Torres was lying to protect his commanding officer, but the young man's sincerity was unshakable. "Mr. Kendricks," Torres said during one particularly aggressive exchange, "I'm not here to protect anyone's reputation. I'm here because someone tried to kill me, and I want to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." On the third day of testimony, the prosecution played the recovered email communications in open court. The electronic evidence was devastating. Not just the communications between Henley and Marshall, but financial records showing payments to civilian contractors who provided the sabotage components. The conspiracy was bigger than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just 3 rogue officers. It was a network involving defense contractors, congressional staff members, and retired generals who saw the integration of women into combat roles as a threat to military effectiveness. When the prosecution rested, Kendrick stood to present his defense. But instead of denying the evidence, he tried a different approach: justification. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice heavy with false sincerity, "my client stands accused of terrible crimes. But before you judge him, consider the context. General Henley spent 30 years defending this nation. He served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and classified operations around the world. He saw firsthand how the political decision to integrate women into combat roles was affecting unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. The argument was dangerous because it contained just enough truth to be believable. There had been integration challenges, and there were legitimate debates about combat effectiveness. But Kendricks was trying to use those complexities to justify attempted murder. General Henley believed, rightly or wrongly, that lives were at stake, that political correctness was being placed above military readiness. His actions, while misguided, were motivated by a genuine desire to protect the soldiers under his command. It was a sophisticated defense, acknowledged the facts but reframed them as patriotic duty rather than criminal conspiracy. For a moment, Ava worried it might work. Then Colonel Morrison stood for her rebuttal. "The defense wants you to believe that attempted murder can be justified by disagreement with policy. That's not patriotism, that's treason. When General Henley swore his oath of office, he promised to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution guarantees equal treatment under law." She walked over to where Ava sat in the gallery. Captain Rilland didn't ask for special treatment. She didn't demand lower standards or easier assignments. She earned her place in military aviation through skill, courage, and dedication. And for that, General Henley tried to have her killed. The closing arguments continued for another hour, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming. The conspiracy was proven, and the human cost was undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of sabotage of military equipment, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, we find the defendant guilty. As the verdicts were read, General Henley showed no emotion. But Colonel Marshall, sitting at the co-defendant's table, broke down completely. Master Sergeant Briggs just stared straight ahead, as if he couldn't quite believe his 30-year career had ended in a courtroom. The sentencing phase would come later, but everyone knew the outcome. General Henley would spend the rest of his life in military prison. His legacy would be forever tied to one of the biggest scandals in Army history. As the court adjourned, Ava felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Captain Maria Vasquez, still walking with a cane 3 years after her accident. "Thank you," Vasquez said simply, "for not letting them get away with it." Around them, the other survivors gathered, 8 women who'd been betrayed by their own service, but had found the courage to seek justice. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. They'd survived, they'd testified, and they'd won. Outside the courthouse, the media was waiting with the inevitable questions about how it felt to win, what message this sent, and what Ava planned to do next. But as she stood on the courthouse steps, looking out at the crowd of reporters and protesters and supporters, Ava realized she wasn't thinking about the future at all. She was thinking about the past, about all the women who'd been driven out of military aviation before anyone started paying attention, about the pilots who'd been transferred, demoted, or forced into early retirement because they didn't have the evidence or the support system to fight back. The victory was real, but it was also incomplete. Justice for the survivors didn't undo the damage to those who'd been silenced. "Captain Rilland," a reporter called out, "what's next for you?" Ava looked directly into the camera. "What's next is making sure this never happens again, to anyone, ever." The words carried a promise that went beyond the courtroom, beyond the scandal, beyond even the military itself. The fight for equality wasn't over. It was just beginning. 6 months after the court-martial, Captain Ava Rilland stood in Hangar 18 at Fort McCall, but everything had changed. The same building that had once housed sabotaged helicopters and corrupt maintenance operations was now home to the Army's new Aviation Safety and Integration Center, where Master Sergeant Riggs had once ordered midnight modifications to flight systems. Teams of investigators now trained military personnel to recognize and report potential sabotage. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Ava had been promoted to major and given command of the center, a position that didn't exist before the scandal but had become essential after the investigation revealed the scope of the corruption. Her mandate was simple: ensure that what happened to her and the other female pilots never happened again. "Major Rilland," came a voice from behind her. She turned to see Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Torres. He'd been promoted twice in the months following the trial, partly for his courage in testifying, and partly because the Army desperately needed officers untainted by the conspiracy. "The new class of investigators is ready for your briefing." Torres had become her deputy, and together they built a program that was already being copied by other military branches. The center didn't just investigate incidents. It proactively audited maintenance operations, tracked personnel transfers that might indicate emerging corruption, and provided whistleblower protection for anyone who reported suspicious activities. In Conference Room A, 24 officers from various bases sat waiting for her presentation. Half were women, a ratio that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier, but was now mandated by new Pentagon policies. The other half were men who'd volunteered for the program, officers who understood that institutional integrity mattered more than old boy networks. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ava began, "welcome to the Aviation Safety and Integration Center. You're here because you've all volunteered to become guardians of institutional integrity. Your job isn't just to investigate problems after they happen. It's to prevent them from happening in the first place." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing photos of the 8 female pilots who'd been targeted by the conspiracy. These women served their country with honor and distinction. They earned their places in military aviation through merit, not politics. And they were betrayed by the very system they'd sworn to protect. The room was silent attention, focused entirely on the faces looking back at them from the screen. General Henley is serving 25 years to life in Fort Leavenworth. Colonel Marshall received 15 years. Master Sergeant Riggs got 10. But punishment after the fact isn't enough. Our job is to make sure there are no more victims like these. The presentation continued with technical details about the sabotage methods that had been used, the warning signs that had been ignored, and the institutional failures that had allowed the conspiracy to flourish. But it wasn't just about the past. It was about building safeguards for the future. The most important thing to understand, Ava said as she reached the final slides, is that this wasn't about a few bad actors. This was about a system that allowed corruption to flourish because good people stayed silent. Your job is to make sure silence is no longer an option. When the briefing ended, a young captain approached her. "Major, I was wondering, how do you keep going after something like that? How do you trust the system again?" It was a question Ava had asked herself many times during the long months of investigation and trial. The honest answer was that she didn't trust the system, at least not blindly. "Captain, I don't trust the system to police itself. That's why we exist. Trust has to be earned, and it has to be verified. Every day, in every decision, at every level of command." That evening, Ava walked the flight line alone, something she'd started doing every night since returning to Fort McCall. The helicopters sat in neat rows under the security lights, ready for the next day's training missions. Everything looked the same as it had a year ago, but she knew better. Hidden throughout the maintenance bays were the new security cameras and audit systems that made tampering nearly impossible. The maintenance logs were now digitally encrypted and automatically backed up to servers that couldn't be accessed by base personnel. Every component that went into an aircraft was tracked from manufacturer to installation, with tamper-evident seals and regular inspections by independent contractors. But the most important changes weren't technological. They were cultural. The new base commander, Colonel Jennifer Hayes, Rebecca's younger sister, selected specifically because of her reputation for integrity, had implemented policies that encouraged reporting of irregularities. Whistleblower protections were real and enforced. Personnel transfers were tracked and investigated if they showed suspicious patterns. Most importantly, the culture of silence that had protected the conspiracy was being systematically dismantled. Ava's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Captain Maria Vasquez, who was now working as a civilian consultant for the Aviation Safety Center despite her permanent injuries. "Saw the news about the Senate hearing tomorrow. Proud of you. Give them hell." Tomorrow, Ava would testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee about expanding the safety programs to all military branches. The Navy and Air Force had already reached out about implementing similar oversight systems, and there was talk of making the programs mandatory across all Department of Defense operations. It would be her biggest stage yet, but she was ready. She'd learned that truth had its own power. Once you started telling it, it became easier to keep telling it. As she headed back toward the barracks, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but she answered anyway. "Major Rilland? This is Captain Jennifer Walsh from Fort Hood. I'm sorry to call so late, but we may have a situation here that requires your expertise." Ava felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with a new case. "What kind of situation, Captain?" "We've had 3 female pilots experience mechanical failures in the past month. Different aircraft, different systems, but the pattern feels ... familiar. My commanding officer wants to handle it internally, but I think we need outside oversight. The old system would have buried Captain Walsh's concerns in bureaucracy and transferred her to silence her questions. But the new system had given her a direct line to the Aviation Safety Center and the authority to bypass local command when necessary. Captain Walsh, you did exactly the right thing by calling. I'll have a team at Fort Hood by tomorrow afternoon. Don't let anyone touch those aircraft until we arrive. Yes, ma'am. And Major, thank you for everything you've done. It's different now, better. Women like me don't have to be afraid anymore. After hanging up, Ava stood in the darkness outside the barracks and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The victory wasn't just about punishing the conspirators or even protecting future victims. It was about changing the fundamental assumption that women in military aviation were problems to be solved rather than assets to be valued. She thought about the Senate hearing tomorrow, about Captain Walsh's call tonight, about all the other women who were flying military aircraft around the world without having to wonder if someone was trying to kill them. The system wasn't perfect. It probably never would be, but it was better. Demonstrably, measurably better. And sometimes, better was enough to build on. As she climbed the steps to her quarters, Ava reflected on something Colonel Hayes had told her during the darkest days of the investigation. The arc of justice is long, but it bends toward truth if you're willing to grab it and pull. She'd grabbed it. She'd pulled it. And now other people were pulling too. The fight wasn't over. There would always be people who tried to abuse power, who saw equality as a threat, who confused tradition with justice. But now there were safeguards, systems, and most importantly, people who refused to stay silent. In her apartment, Ava sat at her desk and opened her laptop to review her Senate testimony one more time. The speech was ready, but she added one final paragraph. Senators, the question isn't whether we can afford to implement these safety and oversight systems across all military branches. The question is whether we can afford not to. Every day, we delay. We risk losing qualified personnel to corruption, sabotage, and institutional betrayal. We risk telling an entire generation of women that their service isn't valued, their safety isn't important, and their lives are expendable for the comfort of those who fear change. She saved the document and closed the laptop. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build on the progress they'd made. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Major Ava Rillans slept peacefully. She'd kept her promise to herself and to all the women who'd been silenced before her. The sky was no longer a battlefield where women had to fight their own side just to serve their country. It was finally, truly, open to everyone with the skill and courage to fly. Outside her window, the lights of Fort McCall glowed against the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a helicopter started its engines for a night training mission. The sound that had once represented betrayal and danger now meant what it was always supposed to mean. The promise that when people needed help, someone would be ready to fly into the darkness to bring them home, no matter who they were, no matter what they looked like, no matter how many people had once thought they didn't belong. The mission continued, but now it was a mission worthy of everyone who chose to serve it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Stories like Ava's remind us that sometimes the greatest courage isn't displayed on distant battlefields, but in standing up to corruption within our own institutions. Her refusal to stay silent didn't just save her own life, it protected countless others who came after her. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up against overwhelming odds to do what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe stories of courage and justice like this deserve to be heard, make sure to subscribe for more incredible true stories that prove ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to back down.